Hello and welcome to the Sandro Forte podcast. Over the many years I've been running a business, I've met many successful people, entrepreneurs, sports stars, celebrities, and dare I say, even royalty. So what makes a person successful? Do we know what success is? And the all-important question, can we create success for ourselves? This podcast series invites a diverse group of people to share their insights, their wisdom, and the things they've learned along the way. Alexi Cantacuzene-Spreansky is the co-founder of the Mayfair collection. He spent the last 20 years in a business development role working across the service industry, fixed on supporting high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals. This has enabled him to gain an intimate understanding of both the needs of these clients and the type of services expected by them. He now focuses on helping others to refine their products and services to suit this highly demanding client base, while at the same time advising clients and their family offices about the best people to use. Now, I can honestly say, without any fear of contradiction, this individual who's been very highly recommended to the Sandro Forte podcast, I'm delighted to have him on the show today. This is probably the best name we're ever going to have on the Sandro Forte podcast. I thought mine was complicated, but this one does take some practicing. Alexi, welcome to the Sandro Forte podcast.
Thank you very much. It is the bane of my life, now yours.
I love it. I absolutely love it. You know, when you've got Alessandro Marco Forte, that causes all kinds of problems. Yours, on the other hand, that's a different level. Where does it come from?
Funnily enough, I've just been doing a piece of homework with my kids and the joys of homeschooling that everyone's suffering. But actually, this bit was quite interesting. We actually went back and had a look at the family tree, and Cantacuzene originated as Cantacuzenos, who were emperors during the Byzantine Empire. And we've dated, I think, the oldest back to 1100 and something. And then they sort of moved into Romania, became Cantacuzino, then moved into Russia and became Cantacuzene, which is where the Spreansky came in, who it turns out was prime minister to Alexander I of Russia. It's all a bit complicated and a pain, really.
Wow. And I'm also loving that beard you're sporting. Tell us about the history of that, because it looks like you've been at that for a while.
Yeah, the beard is I've only shaved it off twice since I was 19. Once was for my grandmother's funeral because she hated it, and the other time was for my wedding because my wife didn't want the photos to date, which was fair enough. But now it is significantly longer than it might have been because my children have bet me that I won't shave till all this is over. So I'm getting to the point of Grizzly Adams, I think.
Well, let's hope for your sake it doesn't go on much longer.
Absolutely.
You might get weighed down by that, but it is very impressive nevertheless. Okay, in all seriousness, we've got you on this podcast, Alexi, because you have a wealth of experience and we want to find out all about you. So let's start the most obvious place, really. Childhood, where did you grow up? How did, all the roads lead to the place you're in now?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question because I come naturally, I guess, from what most would consider to be a privileged background. I was lucky enough to be privately educated. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a loving home, out in the countryside, running around, but also grew up in a slightly kind of confusing way on the basis that, having told you a little bit about my family background, I come from two sides of a family that historically were incredibly wealthy. And like most families that have been through that, it tends to get to the third generation and the whole thing falls over and somebody has very kindly wasted the money away. Where I was brought up in a very lovely way, but always knew that I would have to go to work. This was not something that was going to be sustained. My grandparents paid for our school fees. which is incredibly kind of them. And but also it did mean that we sort of lived this slightly strange life of privilege at their house, which wasn't unlike Downton Abbey, to be honest. To us being a very normal family at home, sitting around the table, cooking our own food and going to the supermarket. But I guess the driver for me early on was being the second son of the only female child. The chances was I was going to get nothing. So I had to kind of make my own way and get on. Which sort of, talking about the education side, having been privately educated, I'm dyslexic. So even with a private education, it wasn't necessarily, or the classroom side of it wasn't necessarily something that massively interested me. But people did. And so my parents spent quite a lot of time finding the right school for me, because historically the family had been to Harrow and, that was just what you did. And so I actively tried to get myself expelled from my prep school in order to not go to Harrow. So I wasn't sure how to have that conversation with my dad. But I think, I ended up going to a very well-known school up in Scotland and had an extraordinary time because it was about people and it was about strength of character. And the school motto is "Plus est en vous," which is there is more in you. And the staff there did all in their power to eke that out, and to, it was tough. And definitely had my down moments there, but most of it was about not just survival, but having the personal skills to be okay in any sort of situation. So, and in a perfect example of that within the school, what with it being partly a charity, I was at school with 2 or 3 princes and princesses of various countries. But equally, I shared a room with one of the guys who came from the fishing village down the road, who sadly had been orphaned. And he was there from a charitable perspective, but equally, I think he probably made my life richer because of his background. And I've always taken that as a very, a real, what's the best way of putting it? A real inspiration. You can never look at somebody and guess what they might be able to bring to your life. And he was a perfect example.
I was listening to you talking about your schooling and being surrounded by princes and princesses. Is that the time you decided to change your name from John Smith to Alexi Cantacuzene-Spreansky?
Yeah, it was.
But with a joke.
It cost me a small fortune, but it was per letter.
So obviously, I mean, it's a number of people we've spoken to that have dyslexia and have struggled with it on the one hand, but have excelled almost because of it as well. It's really fascinating that we talk to so many successful people who have had or had to overcome some of those challenges that many of us don't even think about. So what led to the Mayfair Collective? I think probably a good starting point to understand what exactly it is, and then what skills you talked about. A couple of the characteristics that I guess have developed over time. So and people being a very important part of who you are and how you operate. First of all, what is it, and then secondly, kind of what led you to setting the business up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Mayfair Collective started out 4 years ago, just being an event. I think we'd been to, the 7 of us that were involved at the time had been to endless networking events around London, because it was the main way of us gaining business and meeting new people, and and so many of them were done in a slightly pay to play way, or the guest list hadn't been very well thought out, or you ended up meeting the same people time and time and time again. And there are a few people that I was talking to at the time. They said, well, why don't we just run an event together? So we did, and actually it was the first one we did was at the House of St. Barnabas, which is a beautiful place. If you haven't been, it's definitely worth going. But the House of St. Barnabas was just a kind of a perfect place because of the philanthropic side of the house itself. But also it allowed us to create more of an intimate feel. And it definitely wasn't about gaining business. It was about introducing nice, like-minded people. And, we've been told it's a bit like dating, but and it sort of should be. And I think networking should definitely be about long-term relationships and not just handing over business cards. So we developed that, and from that, a whole load of questions started coming out from those events of, oh, do you know anybody? You introduced me to this person. Do you know anybody that does X, Y, and Z? And inevitably, the answer between us was yes. But then it came down to, well, okay, you're looking for a lawyer. What sort of lawyer are you looking for? And then they go down to their profession. And so let's say it was a family lawyer. Okay, but what is it? What sort of personality do you need? And very often it's the advisor asking the question. And so it became quite obvious to me that fitting people's personalities together, as much as their professional acumen, is sort of the core to business. And so the Mayfair Collective has sort of grown up to be a place where advisors can come and ask a question by describing their client without divulging too much information, but describing their client in such a way that I can put forward three or four options for the advisor to then meet and then put the right person in post. And I think it's become a very cost-effective way and cuts out the time wasting of getting to the right person to serve the right client. Yeah. So we are there effectively as a black book for many professions, but also in that, there's a fair bit of kind of deal flow that comes through as well. So, in the outset of this, somebody came to me saying it was in the very early days when China was still really in bad shape and all the factories were shut, and they had the PPE problem because they weren't making any and they ran out of it so quickly. And so I got a phone call saying, Lexi, listen, of all the people that would know, do you know where to get some? I've been asked by the Chinese government to source some. And within, I think it was 4 or 5 days, we managed to pull together 30 million pieces from around the world. But within, I think, 2 days of us getting them all in the right place, the price point had dropped from £3.86 down to 28p because the Chinese were back online by that point. So then it was a case of, right, well, what do we do with it now? So it's those sorts of things. But on a normal day-to-day basis, it's people looking for a little bit of seed funding. It's people that are wanting to change the network that they're in because they know all the people in their network so well, but they end up, as very often happens with lots of people, you end up being reintroduced to the people that you introduced people to in the first place, which is always slightly embarrassing. And so they come to us just for a bit of a refresher, really.
And I'm interested in this because, in what I do, I have a network of my own. I've always been very reticent to open up my doors to too many people because, as we know, Lexi, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So is there a kind of a vetting process? Because, I'm sure everyone would love to come along to you and say, look, we'd love to be part of your network, please. But there must, I guess, be some kind of process of filtering these individuals and businesses to make sure you are maintaining the very high standards that you've clearly set for yourself.
Yeah, I would hate to call it a vetting process because it makes it sound sort of slightly convoluted. But actually, the key point for us is, do we like them? And in my view, you're never going to work with somebody you don't like. And the chances are, if I like them, then other people will, which probably makes me sound like a bit of a Scrooge. But I think if you can get that personal, the best meetings that I walk into are the meetings where no business is spoken about at all. You just get to know each other. You get to understand a little bit more about each other's backgrounds, about your lives, your kids, where you live, etc., etc. Whereas I think if we can get that bit right and those people are likable, then they will come to an event and we'll invite them to an event. What we do say is that, because we do 6 or 7 a year, what we do say is that we won't invite any one person more than twice in 1 year, which allows the network to remain fresh.
Yeah.
And we're very careful to ensure that the people we are inviting are relevant to the venue that we're at. They're relevant to the other people that are going to be there. But also that we're going to be proud to introduce them to other people in the room. Because it's 2 hours. That's it. It tends to finish at 3 a.m. because everybody gets on. But it's 4 till 6 normally. And so it is part of people's working day. So you do need to get something done. So we spend the first hour and a half walking around introducing people to each other and them having quick 5-minute chats. And if they can switch business cards, great. But what often we say is, well, listen, have a 5-minute now, but I know this person's about to leave. Why don't you come and meet them quickly? And then you guys can stay and have a drink afterwards. So it's not about it being exclusive. It's about it being relevant. It's about it being a nice atmosphere and somewhere that people want to be. And because ultimately the commercial side of the business, because all of that side's free, the commercial side of the business comes out of the additional questions that are asked afterwards.
I love the fact that it's scheduled 4 to 6 and finishes at 3 a.m. I mean, that speaks of the success of your events, Alexi. So a couple of things that you've mentioned I'm going to touch on, if I may. First of all, this whole concept of networking. The millennials of the day would say, networking? Surely not. What's wrong with just a good old-fashioned text message or a bit of social media chat? So I'd like to touch on the importance of networking. And then the other thing that you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, was the importance of people liking each other, that face-to-face, that human interaction, which I think is very easy for us to forget about quite quickly. And I think, given what's happened recently, I think we're all missing that little bit of human interaction again. It sounds to me that that's at the core of the success of your business. What would you say to people who say, networking's dead, we can do all this by text message, SMS, or some other form of very informal or rather very formal communication method that doesn't involve networking? Because in my experience, that good old-fashioned face-to-face, get to know somebody, get to like somebody, still works as well today as it's ever done. But I just like your view on that, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it slightly depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve as somebody in business. But I think to go to the first bit, networking, most people would consider themselves terrible at it because most of them don't know where to start. And actually, where you start is closer to home than you would imagine. And it starts with your friends and your family. And it starts with the connections that you've made at school and the connections that you've made at university, colleagues that you've ended up working with on the way up. Everybody's important. And just going back to my school days, I got given a piece of advice by somebody who was just leaving the school as I got taken around the school before I started. And he said, no matter what, never, ever, ever forget the cleaners. I said, I don't really understand what you mean. He said, they are the most important people in this school. And do you know what? It stood me in really good stead. I would go down and have a cup of coffee with the ladies that washed our clothes. And I would make sure that when I flew back to school, which that makes it sound very grand, but it was a bloody long way. It was 12 hours on the train or 2 hours on a plane. But flew back to school to bring them a brick of cigarettes, JP specials.
Yeah.
And those things were really important. And that network has never left me. Mm. Those people, I can still remember the names of those people because they were massively important to my growing up. And I think everybody that you meet has to be seen in their first instance as an important person. And it's not about what you can get out of them. It's about what you can do for them. And even if, I try to leave every single meeting or every single conversation that I have, trying to work out if there are 5 or 10 people that I could introduce that person to that might further their career, change their life in some way, help them with a particular problem there is at the moment. And I think that's what networking is about. Can you do it virtually? Can you do it over text? I don't think so. I think likability comes down to body language. It comes down to reading people. But then actually I was told the other day, it's probably something to do with my dyslexia. Because to be perfectly honest with you, the first time I read a book, I was about 12, as in from cover to cover. Mm. And my reading age at that time was about 6. So it took me about a year. And so everything that I read had to be through people. I had to read the body language. I had to second guess what was going to come next because everything I learned was from people. Or back then, I guess, watching TV to a certain degree. God bless David Attenborough. But I cannot stress enough how important it is that people are face-to-face, particularly when working in the areas that I do with very wealthy people. You're expected to be trustworthy, and that requires you to be face-to-face.
Yeah.
That requires you to do a good job.
So the obvious question then is, given what's been going on recently, which everyone is now living and breathing 24/7, how does that affect? What are the obvious consequences to your business? The networking, the face-to-face business, and as importantly, what have you done in the face of that challenge to make sure that you survive this pandemic with all the other businesses out there?
It's quite interesting you use the phrase survive. I think the first point of survival in this current situation, which none of us have been in before, is mental health. And what I have already put into my head is that we're going nowhere till minimum of September. Now, if it opens up before that, fantastic. But I'm already there. I'm never going to get this opportunity to spend this amount of time with my family again. I'm never going to get the opportunity to teach my children, which, I can't necessarily say is something I'm enjoying, but it is fascinating. So that's the first thing. I think getting yourself in the right place mentally is really important. I think the second thing, in terms of from a business perspective, I've been very careful in the early stages to leave everybody alone, to let them come to terms with what's going on, because I know a lot of their businesses have suffered massively. And they're going through the stress and strains of furloughing their staff. And, they've got their own problems. They're coping with being at home and the solitude. And so I left everybody alone. But what was interesting was the phone calls that started to come. And they were clearly the people that wanted some input, and not necessarily from a financial perspective, but just they needed that FaceTime. They needed somebody to get on, Zoom or FaceTime or WhatsApp video calls, whatever it might be, just because they wanted to see a face. They wanted to talk to somebody, pour a heart out if they needed to, have a laugh if they needed to. And so I sort of took that as they need something. And if that need is a reassurance, then why can't I introduce them to 10 people, getting them ready for, when we are all back?
Mm.
And that will give them the benefits of, they're still working towards something. They've still got things that are exciting in the future. They've still got people to meet. And so I think from our perspective, we've been very careful to leave people alone, but equally be very open-armed to say, listen, we're not here to make money. We know everybody's struggling. We know everybody's, got to just pay the bills at the moment, and those that they can pay, and those that you are responsible for are the most important, whether that be your staff, whether that be your kids, whether that be your parents. So for us, we're looking at this as less of a money-making type time. We've all had it. We've all had those wonderful LinkedIn approaches of, well, do you need this? And I'm sure you need that at the moment. And in this terrible time, and you just kind of go, oh God, really? Take a breath, have a think about, just have another look at your spelling in your email. You've got time. But it's encouraging people that we are coming back and we are getting excited about it. And I think, weirdly, the face-to-face bit, everybody's going to be desperate when we do all get back to get face-to-face with everybody and have some massive party. And, it's a little bit, there's VE Day coming up at the end of this week, which, it's quite a momentous thing. And it's an extraordinary thing that I don't think would necessarily get the kudos, and it doesn't year on year get the kudos it deserves. But I've got my kids turning around to me and saying, listen, can we make bunting? Can we all have, tea outside in the garden? Can we all, and do something that's important for others and to remember for others? And the philanthropic side of people I have seen in many respects come to the fore during this time, which I think has been really lovely and heartwarming to see.
I tell you what I love, if you don't mind me saying this, Alexi, everything I've heard from you today, I'm going to summarize it probably no better than this. But what I keep hearing is on the flip side of every challenge, there's something really positive. Everything you've said, you have this innate ability to kind of turn it on its head and just go, there's the challenge. But, actually, if you look at it this way, or you've turned it upside down, I guess the question then is that who you are? Are you the fixer? Are you the person that does see the positive in everything and tries to find the solution when everybody is really kind of scratching their heads and wondering, what's next? Is that part of who you are? Is that developed through your experiences? Because clearly you're in the best possible kind of business, given all of those wonderful personality traits that you have. But where does that come from?
God, it's a really interesting question. I don't know. I think through, well, the one thing that again could be more a fault than a praise is my mother's both a vicar and a psychotherapist, which is probably the reason I'm as screwed up as I am. But no, I think I look at any challenge as a challenge. And again, it goes back to my education. It goes back to having to work around dyslexia, because it's not something that goes away. It's always there, and people have it to different degrees. But nothing's impossible. And I like to think outside the box. I like to think about things in a very different way. So when somebody comes to me and says, I've got a problem, I look at it and go, no, that's not a problem. That's a challenge. I love that. I love that I've got something to do. I can think about it. I can take this away. I can think about it. And I think if you look at those challenges, you look at the idea of setting up your own business, you look at, we set up Mayfair Collective on the understanding that we're going to fail, but let's give it a go. Now, is that the wrong way around to look at setting up a business? Almost certainly. But if you don't give it a go, you'll never know. And actually, we've had a really good time doing it. And we don't want to be rich. We don't want to, feel like we can own a yacht. And we just want to be comfortable and have a nice time doing it. And I think if everybody sort of went into business with that in their minds, the moment you stop enjoying it for a period of time is the moment to stop and do something else.
Well, that is a lovely takeaway for everyone listening. So I suppose the last question before we ask you a couple of final questions, the last of the kind of the formal questions that are floating around in my mind is that I guess there's probably no one better to ask than you, Alexi, about, given that you work with so many businesses and seen so many things going on in the last 4 years that you've been running Mayfair Collective, what advice would you be giving to a business owner right now who is probably not able to frame things the way that you've been able to do, kind of thinking, gosh, what does the next 6 months, 12 months look like? How am I going to, use that word again, survive all of this? What words of advice would you give to business owners who might be thinking, gosh, this is all looking a bit bleak at the moment?
I think the natural thing, and again, this word survive, we'll all survive, whether we get COVID or not, whether that means actually we go on somewhere else, or whether that means that we come out the other side completely unscathed. What we need to look at, I think, is what can we do better? And what can we do with this time to improve on ourselves, improve on what we do, and improve the balance of everything that we do. So whether that is family life, whether that's the time that you give to your staff, whether that's as a staff member that you really are giving as good as you feel you should be, and that for whoever you work for, and are you doing it for the right reasons? And I think if you can square all that stuff away and say, yes, I'm doing the best I possibly can, all of the other stuff will come, and all you can do is improve upon it. And I would implore people to speak to each other lots. And there are people that don't like doing video calls. So don't just video call somebody. I've learned that straight off the bat. Give them time, send them a text and ask if they want to call or video. Even though you may feel comfortable with it, they may not. But speak to people, carry on learning from people. Because I have learned everything that I know from talking to other people. And I was given an amazing piece of advice by a godfather when I was about 17, I think. And I was sort of thrashing about, wondering what I was going to do with my life. And he said, what you do with your life doesn't matter. All I would say to you is make sure that you go to 5 interviews a year. And I had no idea what he meant. I said, but what if I love what I do? And he said, it doesn't matter. You need to know what's your value financially, what else is out there, and what other things you might be able to do. And those 3 things have sort of, I always look at other people as being people that I can learn from. And by going to those 5 interviews a year for the last 20 years, it's been fascinating, the people that you meet. But you also go in, everybody gets quite nervous about interviews. I don't think I've ever had an interview and got the job. All the jobs I've ever had have always come out of chance meetings or a conversation in the pub or whatever, and I end up working somebody else. And it's been great. But all of the interviews I've gone into, I've never gone into them thinking, I really, really want this job. I've gone in to learn whether or not it is something I might want.
That is a really great...
Is the person, are they somebody that I really want to break my back for? Are they somebody that inspires me? Are they somebody I can learn from? And I think if you go into those sorts of things, then particularly coming out the other side of this, there will be lots and lots of people wondering what's coming up next. Nothing to stop you starting a conversation with somebody who owns a business who themselves may not know if they're going to come back from this.
Yeah.
But you might start a conversation that means that you both set up doing something else.
Yeah, very good. How do we find out more about you, Alexi? As in, is there a website? Is there any kind of social media presence? So if people want to look you up, they can find you easily enough?
Yes, so mayfaircollective.co.uk, which says a little bit about us. And then we also are on WhatsApp, not WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Perfect.
So do get in touch. We'd be delighted.
Okay. And final question. The question we ask to all of our guests, and it's a very simple one. You've covered so much ground today. You've kind of answered it. But if we could drill it all down, and if one of your lovely kids came up to you and said, "Dad, I'm one of those 17-year-olds that isn't quite worked out what I'm going to do yet. Can you give me that godfatherly piece of advice that you got when you were 17? But just drill it down to one single piece of advice above all others. What would that single piece of advice be?"
It's going to sound very cliched, but I would say help others, because it will come back round.
Well, that's clearly what you do for a living, and it's not cliche at all. It's a mantra I've certainly lived by, and a lot of very other successful people that I've met along the way have had that very much at the forefront of what they do. So all I can say is thank you. I'm losing track of the number of great sound bites and takeaways in today's podcast, and you were very highly recommended for a reason, and I now know what that reason is. So on behalf of everyone listening to this podcast, thank you so much for joining us today. And don't ever change that name by default because it's definitely the best one I've ever come across. So Alexi Cantacuzene-Spreansky, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Sandro Forte podcast.
Thank you very much, Sandro. Thank you.
Well, what can I say? Thank you for joining us on the Sandro Forte podcast. Wasn't Alexi Cantacuzene-Spreansky? I'm going to learn that, and it's going to be etched in my mind forever. He was absolutely inspirational. I love that podcast. Each week, don't forget, we've got a new guest joining us to share their own insights into achieving success or overcoming life challenges. Please make sure you subscribe. Follow us on social media. Sandro's podcast, you know the drill by now. Same on all channels. And if you want to email us, it's hello@sandrospodcast.com. And please remember those other things to connect with me, Sandro Forte. I'm the real Sandro Forte on Instagram for reasons I've explained before. Please leave the reviews on iTunes. That's really important so we know what kind of guests you'd like in the future. And occasionally you do get the chance to be entered into a draw to win one of the prizes donated by one of the guests on the Sandro Forte podcast. Until this time next week, have a good one. See you soon.